So Checkmate 227 study was again presented here at the ESMO 19 meeting as an important study. It's an important study that we've been waiting a long time to hear the final overall survival results for. We've heard a number of secondary endpoints and a co-primary endpoint of PFS by TMB status. Now, the study is a complex study. It took patients in the frontline setting and randomized them contingent on their PD-L1 status. So in the PD-L1 positive group, it randomized them to either Nivo-Ipi, Nivo monotherapy or chemotherapy. When we look at the PD-L1 positive group, that group is positive, but that is a key secondary endpoint and not a primary endpoint. So Nivo-Ipi is positive versus chemo alone, but of course we have to look at what is the influence of PD-L1 status. When we look at that further, that outcome is very much driven by the PD-L1 50% positive group. So to me, this drug has a role, but it has a role in the PD-L1 50% positive group. But in that group, we already have available pembrolizumab. We will shortly have atezolizumab, I hope, on the basis of the IMpower 1110 data. And we're already using chemo-pembro triplets. Now, the hazard ratio for benefit was very similar to what we already have. And the adverse event profile showed a higher rate of adverse events for the double immunotherapy compared to single immunotherapy. So that needs to be borne in mind in decision making. The second aspect of that study was the PD-L1 negative population. In the PD-L1 negative population, patients were randomized to either standard chemotherapy, chemo plus Nivolumab, or Nivo-Ipi. Now that part of the study was positive for overall survival for Nivo-Ipi, but it wasn't a primary endpoint, it wasn't a pre-specified secondary endpoint, it was an exploratory endpoint. So we need to bear that in mind when interpreting the data. When we look at that data, I think it is a potentially important piece of data, because in this setting, the other option that we have is chemo-pembro triplet. So one needs to think about the appropriate toxicities that we'll have with either Nivo-Ipi or chemo-pembro, and the hazard ratio was very similar for Nivo-Ipi versus chemo to chemo triplet versus chemo. So we do have options in that scenario. What was very clear, though, is that tumour mutation burden was not predictive of benefit for Nivo-Ipi. It was prognostic. Patients with high TMB did better with chemo and did better with Nivo-Ipi, and patients with low TMB did slightly worse with Nivo-Ipi and slightly worse with chemotherapy. It wasn't predictive of benefit for Nivo-Ipi.